This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, with his top 3 agricultural law and taxation developments in 2023. K-State's Dorivar, Ruiz, Diaz, and Augustine Obour continue the show by discussing managing soils with high pH levels for soybeans and sorghum. Finishing the show is K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, as he explains why soil temperature and not the calendar is the biggest factor for determining the right time to plant early season vegetables. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show finishing reviewing the top developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2023 with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Roger, today discussing number 1, 2, and 3 from those top developments. And first, starting with number 3, which you decided was California's Proposition 12.
Yeah, we're down to the top 3 developments as I see it, and of course this is how I see these developments in terms of their impact on the agricultural sector as a whole and farmers and ranchers in particular. And at 3, I've got this Proposition 12 in California, and this went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court with a decision in 2023 that probably most listeners have heard about by now. But what Proposition 12 was California coming up with a law that says that you cannot sell pork products in the state of California. And actually, it was a little bit broader than that, but pork is what the Supreme Court opinion addressed. You can't sell pork products in the state of California unless those pork products you can certify were raised in accordance with California standards. And basically, that had to do with the farrowing of the hogs and the raising of the piglets, and the birthing in pens where the sow could get up and turn around and not touch the sides. Well, that's not the way they're produced in the major hog-producing states such as Iowa and North Carolina, and there's reasons for that. And California didn't like that. They thought that that was cruel and inhumane, and so they said, you can't have access to our market if you don't raise the hogs in the manner that we want you to. Now, one of the issues with that is California doesn't raise hogs. They have less than 1% of the pork production in the United States. Very, very small. It's a fraction of 1%. But they consume about 14% of pork products in the country. So it's a very important market to have access to if you're a hog producer.
And what came from this case for hog producers?
Well, this was a challenge couched under the Commerce Clause, and more specifically the Dormant Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which in essence is designed to prevent states from cannibalizing, so to speak, the economic activity of other states. And so if Congress hasn't specified a certain area that of the law that they're going to regulate, then it's up to the states to do that. And the Dormant Commerce Clause, while not in the Constitution, is a constitutional doctrine that says, well, you can't have economic piracy, so to speak, of activities of other states. And there are some detailed thresholds and rules that the court has outlined in determining whether a case violates the so-called Dormant Commerce Clause, with several judges not even believing the Dormant Commerce Clause exists. So when you bring a Dormant Commerce Clause case and it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, you have a tough row to hoe because you've got 2 or 3 justices that right off the bat don't even believe that the concept exists. And you have to allege purposeful discrimination, in this instance by California. And the pork producers that brought the case didn't allege that. They relied on what we call the extraterritorial doctrine, with the result that the court, because they weren't alleging price discrimination, they were just saying, well, this has an extraterritorial effect. There's no effect on California. The entire effect of the law is economically on other states and people in other states. And the court said, look, you're not alleging price discrimination. You're not alleging purposeful discrimination. You're just arguing the effect. And we're not going to adopt a per se rule under the Dormant Commerce Clause that would cause us to strike down state legislation that only has an impact beyond the state's borders. And the court said that was such a bad argument that it, quote, faltered out of the gate, end quote. That's a pretty tough decision. And in fact, Justice Kavanaugh wrote separately, and he criticized the lawyers that brought the case, saying that, quote, it appears, therefore, that properly pled Dormant Commerce Clause challenges to laws like California's Proposition 12, or even Proposition 12 itself, could succeed in the future, or at least survive past the motion to dismiss stage, end quote. So what he's saying here is, look, if you bring a properly pled case, we might be able to hear it, but the court dismissed the case on procedural grounds, but then went ahead to write some various opinions explaining the Dormant Commerce Clause and Commerce Clause doctrine. But this one really raises some concerns in the ag industry, particularly in the pork industry.
Roger, the second top development, in your opinion, for ag law and taxation in 2023, revolving around foreign ownership of agricultural land.
Yeah, this was a really hot issue in various state legislatures in 2023, and even there was talk in the Congress about doing something. There were a number of high-profile issues that occurred in late 22 into 2023 that involved, in particular, China. And China is on our foreign adversary list. And so it really raised the concern at the state level as to the protection of food supply and the ownership of agricultural land needing to be in hands of people that are loyal to the United States. So it's a food security type issue and a food supply issue. And there are about a dozen states in 2023 that enacted laws, one way or the other, restricting foreign ownership. And I'd say probably the two most prominent are Florida and Arkansas. The Florida statute was challenged constitutionally, and it upheld that challenge. And we have seen numerous states, in addition to those dozen or so states that enacted laws, propose legislation. So about half the states in 2023, it was on the radar, either in terms of enacted or proposed legislation, and that's going to continue in 2024.
Roger, as we round out your top developments in agricultural law and taxation, we're ready to talk about number one. And Roger, what is your number one development for 2023?
Yeah, that's the Sackett opinion at the U.S. Supreme Court that was decided on May 25, or the opinion was released on May 25, involving waters of the United States and what is a wetland under the Clean Water Act over which the EPA has jurisdiction. The case itself did not involve an agricultural set of facts. It was a couple in northern Idaho that purchased a lot, a 6/10 of an acre lot, in 2004 that they wanted to build their home on, but it was near numerous wetlands, and the water from those wetlands flowed from a tributary to a creek and eventually ran into a lake about 100 yards from their lot. Now, the lake, Priest Lake, is a navigable water of the United States. It is a WOTA, subject to the Clean Water Act. And so EPA said that their lot was also a wetland subject to, it was a navigable water of the United States, in other words, a jurisdictional wetland. But the court disagreed with that unanimously. They said, no, it is not, and not subject to the EPA jurisdiction. And all of the justices rejected what's known as the significant nexus test when determining whether the federal EPA and the Corps of Engineers has regulatory authority over wetlands. So they all rejected that test. They didn't all agree on what the proper test is, but a majority of them said that you have to have a continuous surface connection from a wet area to an actual navigable water of the United States, and that was not present in this case. So we got a unanimous rejection of the old test of significant nexus, and we got a new test in terms of continuous surface flow, and agriculture is pretty happy about that one.
So now what does the EPA and Corps have to do to be able to have jurisdiction over water?
Well, they rewrote their rule. Remember what happened in late 22 and was finalized in early 23 before the court's opinion came out. The EPA wrote a new rule, basically going back before the Trump administration to the old Obama-era rule, and the court said that rule's not good. So the federal agencies had to rewrite their rule. They did. in 2023 that immediately was challenged by numerous states. And so here we go with continued litigation on exactly what the rule should look like.
So, Roger, as we're thinking about water, something really important to agriculture, really what do you see with this Waters of the United States case moving forward?
Well, we'll have to watch the litigation against the agencies on the new rule. Some in agriculture believe that it's not completely in line with what the Supreme Court said. A couple of states are claiming that the rule violates the supremacy clause of the Constitution. They're overriding state rights. Texas is one of those states. But I think that's where the focus is going to be moving forward on this in terms of what the courts will say as to whether the new rule actually complies with what the Supreme Court has said.
Roger, if someone would like to check out all of your top developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2023, where can they do that?
They can find that on my blog, and that's Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR, as well as over on the AgManager website at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some top developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2023.
Thank you very much.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen, and he was discussing his top 3 developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2023. If you'd like to see his top 10 list and the honorable mentions, you can read about them by going to his website, Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR, or you can also find it on the Agricultural Economics Department website here at K-State at AgManager.info. If you'd rather give them a listen, we've covered his top 10 as well as the honorable mentions, and you can listen to those by going to past podcast episodes of Agriculture Today. You can find those on your favorite podcast streaming platform or by going to agtoday.net. And also on agtoday.net will be today's show notes, where I will put links to all of these resources if you'd like to find out more information. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show discussing managing high pH in soils. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Diaz and K-State soil scientist based in Hays, Kansas, Augustine Obour. Dorivar, Augustine, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, kicking off our conversation about high pH in soils, what are some problems or consequences with that?
Yes, Shelby, this is a problem that we see more often in western Kansas, where we tend to have more of the high pH soils. And when we talk about high pH soils, we're really talking about something that's going to be at least 7.4 or higher. And more often, we're talking about pH that is around 8 or even higher in some cases. So that's the range that we're talking about. These soils oftentimes will also tend to have some level of free lime or calcium carbonate. So that's also something that we can measure in a soil test. So it's not just the pH, but what happens is once you get to those very high pH, you start to basically see an accumulation of calcium carbonate. Something that's very typical of these soils also is that they tend to be low in organic matter compared to other soils. So that tends to contribute a little bit on the problem, limiting crops growth, especially soybean and sorghum, which are the more sensitive to this condition. And it is something that tends to be quite irregular in the field as well. We don't tend to see entire fields. In some cases we do, but oftentimes tend to be more parts of the field, patches here and there, and that can make things a little bit more challenging in terms of how we manage it to make sure we have some production in those fields.
And Augustine, as we're thinking about management, what are things that producers might want to be doing?
Yeah, so thank you. This is an issue that we tend to see here in Western Kansas in sorghum. So grain sorghum tends, you look at a big field, you see intervenial chlorosis of the younger leaves, and this is typical symptoms of iron chlorosis, which tends to be, like Dorivar said, very patchy in the field. So in terms of management, one of the things long-term, if you want to manage this long-term, is probably apply some manure or compost to the field to build up the organic matter content of the soil. But for immediate management, some of our research that we've done looking at iron chelate application is very effective in managing iron chlorosis in sorghum.
Is this something that will ever just fix itself, or does a producer need to step in?
Well, a producer needs to step in this because this is an inherent soil problem. One of the things that Dorivar mentioned is the calcium carbonate level. So if you have higher calcium carbonate, it makes a huge difference. We saw some research that we did on farm. Soils have the same pH around 7.6, but the calcium carbonate content, one of the sides has 2.5%, and the other side has 8%. The side that has 2.5%, the sorghum was actually able to grow out of the chlorosis once we have some rain, more rain coming in July. But the side with more free line, the plants did not recover. So that is a huge problem. In that case, you may have to plant something like a tolerant sorghum hybrid. That is also very important. Some hybrids are a little bit more tolerant to iron chlorosis, and some are highly susceptible. So looking at planting tolerant hybrids and also applying chelate, especially if you know that you have field history. So this is not something you apply to the whole field, just in the patchy areas where you have the problem. So that is one of the things that you can do. Just where you know you have problems, you just apply the chelate to the sorghum in that area.
And Augustine, you did research on the sorghum side of things, and Dorivar, you did them on soybeans, and did you see similar things?
Yes, Shelby, we done quite a bit of work on this, both sorghum, which is what Augustine did, and we also look at this management using chelates in soybean, especially irrigated soybean in western Kansas. Again, as we're trying to move more acres there, and where we have the irrigation, that becomes a huge challenge for soybean. One of the things that I want to just highlight a little bit from Augustine's comment is the effect of the environment, and I think this is important because we're talking here about iron chlorosis and obviously, again, the pH and carbonates. But we tend to see some things get worse some years, especially when you have added stress to the crop, right? When we have, like Augustine mentioned, drought, or maybe some cases excessive moisture, very low soil temperature, that kind of things can make things worse. And so it's really something that can vary also depending on the year because of those conditions. One thing that we evaluate in the case of soybean is actually looking at different chelate iron fertilizer options. We look at things like EDTA, which is very common, very popular, tends to be a little bit lower in price. But one that really shows the most promise and really shows a benefit is the use of EDDHA, which is a type of chelate that tends to be a lot more stable in those very high pH situations that we're talking about. Again, one of the challenges with some of the cheaper sources is that when you get to some of those very high pH situations, the chelate is no longer essentially working. And so again, the higher price, but it's a much better option. EDDHA options work very well both for soybean and sorghum. Just a couple considerations there. One thing that I want to highlight, like Augustine mentioned, because of the high price of this fertilizer, is not something that is economical to apply across the entire field. And so this is something to think about in terms of how we do this application and targeting the fields. Oftentimes become a precision ag question, really. How do we do this variable rate and be able to target these parts of the field to be cost effective? And so that's one aspect. The other thing is the type of application. When we talk about a micronutrient like iron, oftentimes we talk about things like foliar application. And I know we tried this in soybean, and I believe Augustine tried the same thing in sorghum, and we don't really see the same benefit. It really needs to be applied in contact with the seed in furrow application to really see that benefit. So there's a few considerations here in terms of application methods, parts of the field that we're putting on, and the type of chelates that we're using, which is very important. Again, we haven't seen the same level of result with some chelates, that things like EDTA, for example. And again, that in-furrow application in soybean also works very well, and we see some very good yield benefits in that kind of situation.
Yeah, so I'll add to what Dorivar just said. In-furrow application is really critical in sorghum that we worked with. We did both in-furrow, and then we also did post-application. If you wait for the chlorosis to begin with, then you are playing catch-up in terms of foliar application. And you apply it, you have to do more than one application. In our case, we did about 2 applications, and we even started 2 weeks after planting. And we saw some response. If you wait a little bit longer, like a month, and you apply it, you may not see any response. And in this case, we apply 3 pounds per acre of the product, 6 pounds, and then 9 pounds. And we saw that the 3 pounds application rate provided effective control similar to the higher application rates. So we think at that time that we did it, it was economically viable because you are not applying it to the whole field. And then one thing that Dorivar mentioned, I also want to highlight that is the presence of moisture. If it's too wet, the iron solubility decreases. If it's too dry, the solubility decreases because it converts from iron 2 to iron 3, which is not available. But if you have adequate moisture, then you can have enough iron available for the plant. And that is why we tend to see that towards July, August, fields that are not severely chlorotic, they tend to recover from iron chlorosis. And this is because of good moisture conditions. That changes the iron chemistry in the soil and also water helping root growth. I think soybean may have different application amounts that may be needed. If Dorivar, you have anything to say on that?
Application rates for soybean is similar from what we found, and so those rates of about 3 pounds per acre in furrow application works perfect for soybean, just the same as sorghum. And so again, it is a good option, similar application methods for both crops that we found.
What is a good way for producers to learn if their soil is high in pH?
Yes, of course, this is something that we have to do soil tests and really find out whether or not this is one of the issues. Oftentimes, we tend to see yellow, soybeans or sorghum, and perhaps we are not quite sure what is the problem. And again, that soil test to look at pH, but not just pH. We really need to look at carbonates as well to really tell us whether or not this is an issue. And again, once we start to see some level of carbonate accumulation, more likely we're dealing with an iron chlorosis problem, and definitely we need to look at some of these management options.
Dorivar, Augustine, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about how producers might want to think about managing high pH.
Yeah, thank you. And then some of this information we've also published. You go to the K-State has fertilizer reports that we publish annually. So I think the work on iron chlorosis may be 2016, 2017. So if you check our reports around that, you should be able to find this publication. This research was done in Western Kansas, so it's very applicable to our environment.
That was K-State soil scientist based in Hays, Augustine Obour, and he was joined by K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. And in today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link the research that they've done around sorghum and soybeans. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Whether you're planting peas, spinach, lettuce, or green onions, soil temperature, not the calendar, is the biggest factor in determining the right time to plant. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, explains why soil temperature is so important for early season garden vegetables. Greg, the little bit of warm weather we've had has people thinking about, gosh, it's almost time to get out into the garden. It's really not yet, but we're getting closer and moving in that direction. What are some of the cole crops that we focus on early in the season?
Yeah, so there are some things we can plant earlier than others, and probably the most common one people think about is peas. If you want to plant some snow peas, snap peas, those can take the cooler soil temperatures, but the soil temperature, we want a consistent warming of that soil. Vegetable gardening is kind of a race, typically. We want it to get going quickly out of the ground and to a harvest state as quickly as possible, and so temperature is one of the big regulators of that. We're looking at soil temperatures of minimum 35 degrees for some of our cool season vegetables, let's say spinach and parsnips and those things. 40 would be a little bit better. 70 is wonderful. Those seeds will really quickly germinate and go, but we're not going to wait till the soil temperature gets that high. So Basically, a soil temperature, you can use the Mesonet to identify soil temperatures around the state. You can use a soil thermometer. Those can be purchased fairly inexpensively. I kind of have a thing going with our fax agent that I use her meat thermometer has a soil thermometer, and that gets us close enough as far as what the soil temperature is.
And in terms of what we want to plant, we need to start making those decisions now.
Yeah, parsnips is one of those early things we can plant, but may not be on your menu as far as what you want to eat. So definitely grow stuff that you're interested in consuming and using, and there's information out there as far as soil temperatures or what plants need. The K-State Vegetable Planting Guide has a really good resource for when to plant as far as a calendar, but it also has soil temperature on there for when it really would germinate, depending on the growing conditions that we have.
And also keeping in mind just how large you want that garden to be.
Yes, the Vegetable Planting Guide talks about how much of a row you should plant for how many people you're trying to feed. So that gives you a guide as far as that is concerned. So it's a good resource to have.
Hopefully people did some soil preparation ahead of time. If they didn't, are there some things that they could be doing?
Yeah, so hopefully you did some soil testing and or adding organic matter last fall. Still not too late to necessarily do that. The challenge that we need to be aware of is wet soil. Working wet soil with our clay soil that many of us deal with creates hard clods that really won't break down until next fall, so to speak. It takes a long time for that to occur. And so that would be hard for our seeds to germinate through. So sometimes, very wet conditions, you may want to top dress your seeds instead of planting them in the soil. You plant them on top of the ground, and then you can cover them with some potting media or some other material to keep that seeds covered and moist and for germination. So if it's really too wet, there are ways around that if it's the time you need to get planting.
We've probably also noticed how well the garden is draining or not draining right now.
Yeah, one of our biggest factors if you plant too early is wet soil and rotting of the seed. And so that's our caution there. We want to have good drainage, the best drainage we can, and that's soil preparation, adding organic matter probably to our soils every year, incorporating that so that the seeds are not sitting in moisture. Again, our only recourse if that is occurring is maybe planting above ground. Containers is another option. So if your soil is really not functioning for you, you can plant a lot of these vegetables in containers, which would mean you're probably using just a growing media with some fertilizer to fulfill the needs of the seed.
So really get out, find the seeds that you want to plant, and then check those guides and make sure that you're planting at the right time.
Yeah, soil temperatures are a real guide for when to plant. They're cold hardy plants, so once they get up and it's maybe in the 30s, they're still okay. It's just getting them out of the ground, and that takes a certain level of temperature.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with tips for getting started with early season crops. For more information, contact your local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.